Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Motivational Mondays presented by the NSLS, where we now have proudly reached over 2 million members nationwide. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Allison Sweet Grant, an accomplished writer whose work has been featured in the New York Times and The Atlantic. She holds dual master's degrees from the University of Michigan and has previously worked as a psychiatric nurse practitioner. Allison is also a poet and an avid film enthusiast, and she joins us today to discuss her debut novel, I Am the Cage, which is a deeply moving young adult novel that explores themes of resilience, autonomy, and healing from medical trauma. Inspired by her own experiences within the healthcare system, Allison brings a unique and powerful perspective to this conversation. We're thrilled to have her. Allison, welcome to Motivational Mondays.
Thank you, Corey. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to have you. And I think I told you a little bit before we started recording that as I was reading your book, I made like a surprising sort of like correlation to the main character, Elizabeth, because, she's very guarded and she's very sort of like suspicious, if you will, of the whole world in a way. And I feel like I sort of related to that, my own sort of like unresolved traumas. But in any event, we can get more into that. But for you first, your background is really diverse, from psychiatric, nursing to writing. So can you share a bit about your journey and the journey of what led you to become a writer?
Absolutely. This book is based upon experiences that I had growing up as an adolescent in the healthcare system. And although it's not a memoir, I did try to inject my own experiences and my own emotions into this book as much as possible to tell the story that I've really been keeping within me for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a coming of age story about a young woman who's grappling with medical trauma and her search for healing and her search for meaning. And although it's based off of the experiences that I had, it's really much more about the emotional journey, the toll that something like that can take upon a person, upon a child in particular, and about how it affects their relationships with family and peers, as well as the impact on one's own self-worth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really true. And I think one thing that resonates for me again with this too is that so many of us don't realize we have this unresolved trauma. Like, one of the examples I will share is like, I watched a show I'm kind of obsessed with called My 600-Pound Life. It's a kind of interesting show about obesity. And when they really dissect a lot of why these people have become obese, there's a trauma tied to it, something unresolved. And when they start to tell about it, maybe it was psychological or sexual or verbal or whatever it was, I wonder if you have examined that part of it, like how many of us really are suffering from unresolved traumas.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that show. I've seen that show many times. And, for me, I was born with one leg shorter than the other. And at the age of 11, I underwent this very intense and prolonged procedure to stretch my leg, to stretch the bone. And it wasn't just one surgical procedure. It was a 2 years long intervention that involved having a 20-pound metal fixator attached to my leg. And it was pretty arduous. The procedure itself is remarkable and miraculous and life-changing in many ways, but it's also pretty grueling, especially for a kid. And I knew that I had trauma from this experience. It wasn't, it wasn't always there on the surface. Some of it was, I definitely had to dig deep in order to find it and incorporate it into the story. But I knew that this was something that was challenging for me at a challenging time.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like in some ways it was cathartic for you writing this book? Because you're of course thriving today despite having that situation. And of course it was for it to better your life, obviously, in the long run. But you mentioned it was traumatic. Was writing this book still sort of a way to purge some of that trauma?
Absolutely. It was incredibly cathartic and incredibly healing. And, although it started with my story, I knew it really couldn't end that way, right? This is fiction.
Mm.
And, as the character developed, as she sort of took on a life of her own, I realized that as the author, I had to be true to her story as well, even when it differed from mine. And in that way, it sort of allowed me to give myself the story that I wish I had back
Mm.
then, or the story that I wish I could have read back then. It allowed me to write a different ending for myself. And that was really cathartic and
Yeah.
rewarding.
I love that. It's almost like having the opportunity to kind of go back and redo things in a way. It's like I always make TV references, but it reminds me of the TV show Younger, which is another brilliant show where the woman goes back. She looks like she's 26, but she's really 40. So she goes back and she redoes her 20s again the way she would have liked. So that's great that you were able to kind of share your story, but then sort of alter the what if
Mhm.
possibility.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
I enjoyed doing it, and it was actually really fun. And writing is such a creative process. And not only are you bringing in your own experience, but then your imagination, and tying the two together. And it
Mm.
was it was something I really enjoyed doing.
Yes, and I'm going to just give you like some props too on how well you do it because one of the things for me was as I was reading it, it was cinematic. Like the snow globe component, for example, is really beautiful. And when you describe how the sun, I don't wanna give it all away, but you're
Mhm.
very literary when you describe things. Like I love how the sun was almost blinding against the white snow, so you had to cover your eyes, and I was seeing all of that. And Mr. Ito, like I want to know him, like I want to work for him and stuff. He's like
Me
really,
too.
yeah, he's such a nice man. But you brought us in, and so that style of writing for you, I mean, there's some people who aren't that descriptive. Why do you think you see and paint such a vivid picture when you share a story?
Hmm. Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. That's incredibly generous of you. And um, this story is so visceral for me. I mean, and so raw that it really just felt natural to be as descriptive as possible and convey what I was feeling and what I hoped the character would be feeling into something beautiful. And I just, I love poetry. I've always been a fan of poetry, and I think that it is such a gift in helping to describe things that always don't come easily
Mm.
to traditional prose. And it felt very organic to incorporate that into the book.
Yeah. And it was great because it kind of I wasn't really sure where that's the beauty of it is I wasn't really sure where it was going. Am I reading a story first about teenage angst or young girls angst? And it started off with that sort of, but there was something behind it where, I kept reading going, okay, what is going on? What is this thing that she's so guarded and protected against? And then when you share it, it all makes sense. Sort of like the beautiful alliterations you shared almost help juxtapose a bit of a dark story because she's so impacted by that trauma. So I think it's a really good balance how you frame the story with those colors and textures.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. So as Elizabeth is the protagonist of the story, and she isolates herself, due to the past trauma, as we discussed. Do you have sort of when you're writing a book like that that's drawn on your own experiences, do you have this sort of like trepidation of like, okay, how much of me am I really going to put into this? And how much is going to be solely Elizabeth's? And like, how's that? What is there a challenge there to balance it out?
Yeah, there was definitely a challenge. And I don't know if I ever really got it right. I just sort of um, pulled pieces together that felt I wanted to tell a complete story.
Hmm.
And part of that is pulling from my experience, and part of that is expanding upon it in a way that would relate to the reader, or I should say, in a way that I hoped the reader would relate to it.
Hmm.
um, I try to be as honest as possible in writing the story, and in writing the parts that came from my own life. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like, there's not like a rule that I followed in terms of this is how much of my real experiences in the book, and this is how much I came up with on my own. But
Hmm.
um, the real challenge was in weaving those pieces together, and that's sort of where the story takes place in 11-year-old Elizabeth's past and in 19-year-old Elizabeth's present,
Hmm.
and trying to weave those two pieces together into something that makes sense, and something that tells a complete story, and something that connects to the reader.
Yeah. Yeah, as you mentioned, the poetry component, which is something we all can relate to because it's one of the most early forms of like literature that we all are exposed to as children, even if it's a children's book where it's written in these very like kind of rhythmic, 4 lines to begin with until you get into much more maybe sophisticated poetry. You also incorporate, as you mentioned, the childhood flashbacks where she's 11 years old. That part I think is particularly important because we all can relate to sort of like reflecting back. So tell me about like why that part of the story was really important for you to make sure that like 11-year-old Elizabeth wasn't lost in like the prose of 19-year-old Elizabeth.
Yeah. Well, 11-year-old Elizabeth is really like the catalyst for the story, because this is where she, goes through this experience that alters her life thereafter. And it was important to me to be very detailed and descriptive of that stage of her life, because it really conveys how we carry those experiences right throughout our future, and
Mhm.
how it's hard to leave things like that behind. And I didn't want to just gloss over it. I wanted to be um, as I wanted to be careful, but also considerate of my truth, of my experience, and also um, what the character wanted to put out there into the world.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, I think it's important for kids to read stories about other kids and
Mm.
unique experiences that other kids have, or continue to go through. And if anything, I hope that reading this story encourages kids to use their own voice. I was 11 when I went through this experience. I wasn't comfortable using my voice at the time, but what I've learned from writing this story and sharing my own is that um, it's never too late to rewrite your own story and turn something really challenging into something really beautiful.
I love that. And that's really important too for us as a leadership podcast because many of the people I speak to, that is sort of what their obstacles were. They overcame. There was something in the way or something they had to overcome and they faced it and turned it around because you can either be a victim or you can be a victor.
Mm.
And so it's really about the choice that we make. So I love that, you emphasize that. I do wonder too, with your personal experience, if you don't mind me asking, was that something for you as a child that made you feel self-conscious because, kids can be cruel? Were you a victim of any of that sort of, I guess bullying perhaps just because kids can, when they're different, you kind of experience that. Was that a part of your narrative personally?
It was. It definitely was. But something that I like to think about when I talk about this story is that I think it's okay to be grateful and grieving at the same time. Grateful for the opportunities that I was given and all of the really good things that came out of it, because there were really good things that came out of it, but also sad for the things that didn't go so well, you
Mhm.
know? And I think, I think every kid can relate to that. Or I hope so
Yeah.
anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, both things could be true at once, absolutely. And your story reminds me of someone else I interviewed. His name is Rob Shooter. He's a very established Hollywood gossip columnist and guru. He's always on like a lot of the major shows as a British royal. That's part of his big thing. But he was born. His arm got damaged at birth. He shares, and one arm is shorter than the other. And by sharing his story, he talks about how he was self conscious and always tried to hide his arm, because he felt self-conscious. And here he
Mm.
is trying to work in Hollywood where everything is about the visual and about being perfect. And one day he just said, the hell with this. This is my arm. This is who I am. That doesn't define me. I'm going to go out there and, do my thing and show the world who I am. And that's when he thrives. So much of what you're saying is about self-acceptance too, I think.
Mhm.
How does that play into, you think, your own personal success? The moment of going, this is me.
It's something that I still struggle with. I mean, when I decided to tell this story, it was a big leap of faith because it's something that I have kept to myself and
Mm.
kept quiet for so long. I I also suffered with embarrassment and wanting to hide parts of me that I couldn't change. It's not something that got better like as soon as I published this book or as soon as I thought about publishing the book. It's still a struggle. Um, but I think it's also really important to push yourself even when maybe you're not so sure. And that's sort of, what I'm doing here as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and in a way, like overcoming that, having that kind of resilience, which is one of the words that best describes his character. That resilience almost becomes like your superpower. Like you wouldn't be the strong, resilient person had you not gone through that terrible thing that kind of
Mhm.
made you the fabulous person you are
well,
today.
I'm
So
still working on it, but thank you.
you're very welcome. And I even love how you describe that moment in the book where Elizabeth is like in the doctor's office and she's like, she's trying to assess what she's knows they're talking about, which is the surgery. And, the comparison of like, he's the guy who created the surgery is the one who you thought about like how horses are sort of harnessed together on their back legs. It's just imagining how a child is processing all that. And then that is an indelible, obviously, mark that does not leave probably ever throughout your life. So I can imagine, I guess with what you're saying, that never leaves you, no matter how far you kind of go beyond it.
Yeah. I
Hmm.
think it opens up a broader conversation about how we regard children in healthcare. And, one of the things that I'm a really big advocate for is honesty. I think kids can handle so much more than we think that they can. And so often, parents and providers alike, with the best of intentions, try to hide some of the details that it might be scary or might be
Hmm.
painful. But what they end up doing in the long run is just postponing the pain as opposed to realizing that kids are resilient, realizing that they deserve the truth, they deserve honesty, they deserve dignity, and a sense of control in a situation where there may be very little to begin with,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a young woman named Chelsea Bear who was born with cerebral palsy, and she worked in media, and she actually started chronicling her life on social media, just doing her everyday things, going to Starbucks, going to grocery store, and she visibly has this condition that since she had it as a child, and she noticed that parents would like pull the kid away when the kid was
Mhm.
like, looking like, mommy, why is she walking like that? Or why is her hand shaking? And the parents would pull the kid away. And Chelsea would finally go, no, don't do that. Like, tell your kid that sometimes some people's bodies do this and others do that. And that way it's not weird to your kid when they
Mhm.
see someone walking like that. It's just normal. And so
Right.
that's a big part. Yeah, I think what you're saying is we can condition children earlier just to know that life is diverse like that.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
I think it allows them to have mature emotional reactions to things as well. Not only if they see somebody who looks different in the grocery store, but for when they're in the doctor's office too, and something scary is happening or then a needle is coming toward them, right?
Hmm.
It's an opportunity for them to ask questions and know that they can get honest answers from the people that they trust.
Yeah, yeah. And make it less scary because the doctor's
Mhm.
office for kids can be really terrifying.
Absolutely.
Right, 9 times out of 10, that needle doesn't even hurt, but the
Right.
look at it, it looks horrifying, but it's like you don't even feel it.
Right.
Um, I I found an interesting sort of like coincidence too that you happen to have this book where one of the subplots or sub themes, if you will, is autonomy over one's own body, and that is such a kind of hot button issue right now in general, and with women. And of course, your character, the protagonist, is a woman. So, what's your thoughts on that sort of? I mean, is that intentional? I mean, is there any sort of like advocacy going on in that when you're writing about this, or this is purely just coincidental?
I mean, I'm not a spokesperson or, anything like that, but I do think that agency in healthcare is something that is not discussed a lot in fiction.
Mm,
And this is, like I said, an experience. Based off of a true experience that I had. And it's unfortunate that I didn't have agency then. Luckily, what I went through happened 30 plus years ago. And something that I've learned recently, which is, really amazing, is that there are so many more resources for kids and families now
mm,
than there were when I was going through this.
yeah.
There are podcasts and support groups and all kinds of things. And, I think that's amazing. And it gives people the opportunity to help themselves, in a way. And
Hmm.
that's something that I wish I would have had access to when I was going through it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're right. The advances in medicine happen so quickly, and I wonder if that's even. I mean, do you know today if there's a different way in which they handle that condition, or is it pretty much still similarly held, done the same way?
So the fixator itself, the device itself, has changed in some ways over the years, but and it's if I'm not mistaken, there are different kinds of fixators that are used for different kinds of
Mm,
corrections.
okay.
But the procedure that I had, it is still in use. It does still exist, and I'm so happy to see that when people undergo these procedures, a lot the care that they receive is more holistic
Mm,
now than it was back then. There's trauma informed care and person centered care, and like a whole team devoted to the success of the patient, which
hmm.
is incredible, and just gives everybody a much better chance to come through it without the trauma attached to it.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And you do, well, we did tap into a little bit about what might have been challenging when it comes to knowing, or how much of your personal story are you going to put in the book. But were there any other challenges, or was there maybe you would say another challenge singularly that you faced while writing this book? Anything that comes to mind?
Well, I mean, just writing a book is
Right, right.
for
That
for
alone,
me,
yeah.
yes, is a feat. And you know, I um I started writing I started writing this book in 2020.
Hmm.
Parts of it did come directly from some of my journals that I kept as a teenager, particularly certain lines in the poetry. But the real bulk of the novel I started writing in 2020, and
Hmm.
I've dedicated the last 5 years to it. And it's been a huge part of my everyday. So for me, I would say that has been, um, a new challenge. But
Mm,
overall, I really enjoyed the experience. I loved sitting down at my computer and letting these thoughts and words pour out of me, and it felt almost like a calling in a way.
mm.
So it wasn't a challenge to sit down and do it.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a commitment once you started. But that time period, though, maybe part of the blessing is that that was like right at the start of the pandemic or so, right? Like right around the pandemic time,
Mhm.
2020. So at least you were probably locked down, had no choice really than to write because at that point the entire country was pretty much on lockdown.
It was.
Yeah, yeah. I do wonder too, as a former psychiatric nurse practitioner, which I think is fascinating in itself. Um, how has that experience working in mental health shaped your storytelling style
Hmm.
and how you develop characters, or is there a correlation at all?
I think, I think if anything, it's made me more sympathetic as a parent. more sympathetic as a child, more sympathetic as a patient. Um, Everyone's just trying to do their best. And, sometimes things don't go right.
Mm,
And that's sort of, was where the story began. But I think it's given me, you know, another way to look at it is working in healthcare. I'm lucky enough to have three different perspectives that pertain to this book,
mhm,
that of a parent and a patient and a provider. And I, although the main character tells the story from a first person perspective, I like to think that I utilize some of my knowledge as a provider to direct the actions and emotions of some of the other characters in the book.
mm. Yeah, definitely. And I think for people who are aspiring to write, that's going to be, there's always someone out there who probably they're like a closet writer, they want to write a book, they're journaling, they're doing, they have aspirations but don't know how to begin or don't know like some of the nuanced differences. I do want to ask you because you, as I mentioned, you worked for New York Times, you've written for The Atlantic, but that's different than writing a novel. So how does like long form fiction compare to when you're doing like a journalism piece or an essay? What are some of like nuanced differences for that?
Well, I'm not a journalist, but I have written pieces
Mhm.
for those entities. Um, for me, it was much more of a creative process writing the book,
Mhm.
and I didn't have a timeline in mind, so I didn't feel pressure. I have to write 1,000 words today, or I didn't feel that pressure. I just really let it come naturally, and I think that's why I was able to write this story at that time because it came so naturally to me. I
Mhm.
don't know if I would have been able to do it if I was under like the direction of something specific or if I was fulfilling an assignment.
Right.
It really came from within, and it was a story that was in my heart and on my mind, and it felt like the right thing to do to put it down on paper
Mm.
or
Yes.
in a laptop.
Yeah, exactly. Or sometimes on a napkin or wherever,
Right.
right, right, I know, believe me, I've been there. And it reminds me though of what I've heard from other writers, which is you raise a good point there. It's like, don't get so caught up in the formality of like, what kind of piece am I going to write? Am I going to write this or that? Like, just start writing,
Mhm.
right? Just get the idea from here out, and then it'll kind of you'll know where it's going as you're writing it, but you can almost stifle yourself if you say, okay, I'm going to write this thing today, and then it doesn't come,
Mhm.
but you have a great idea that you did not then start to put on paper and evolve and develop. So there is a balance there as well, I think, to be. It's like a cautionary tale, I think, as well
Yes.
there.
Although I think there are some writers who do work well with those sort of rules, right? Writing, I must write 1,000 words today. Or
Mm,
I think it just, depends on your personality and your working style. But
yeah.
that wasn't the way that I went about it.
Wonderful words of wisdom from Allison Sweet Grant, accomplished writer whose work has been featured in the New York Times and The Atlantic, and now the debut book, I Am the Cage. Allison, thanks so much for the conversation, and thanks for being here today on Motivational Mondays.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you.